If substitutes are a threat to the firm's profits because of the way that it influences the responsiveness of customers to price changes through the elasticity of demand, then what can the firm do about it? What kind of strategic responses might it undertake? Well, one approach is to carry out what's called product differentiation. So to differentiate a product simply means to make it different from that of other goods that are offered by other sellers. Now, that product differentiation can be real in terms of changing the characteristics of the product, or at least it's going to seem as if the product is different in the eyes of the customer. So what you're trying to do is to create a greater distance between your product and possible substitutes for it. If there are fewer close substitutes, then, as we've seen, the elasticity of demand is going to be affected. It'll be less elastic, and that's going to mean that the firm is going to have more market power, and therefore that should be good for its profits. So again, the term market power simply means the freedom that the firm has to set prices without worrying so much about what's going to happen to its customers. One way that we can think of product differentiation is to think of it as something that happens kind of continuously over time. So firms can always be trying to make changes to their product. They may have to do that, in fact, because if a firm develops a new product which increases its market power, that increase in market power might not be permanent. It might simply be temporary, because other firms may be playing the same game. In other words, you can find the firms in a kind of arms race. Everybody's trying to stay one step ahead of everybody else. And as a result, they would be continually changing the characteristics of their products. So this is just saying that an increase in market power is going to be eroded over time. It will weaken. The firm could then respond by carrying out research and development and changing its product yet again. Let's just look at an example. I looked up the life history of this Apple product called the iPod Nano. I never owned one myself, but I guess it holds songs and you can listen to music on it. So over these years, between 2005 and 2017, the characteristics of the iPod Nano kind of continually changed. So there was an attempt to, for example, have a new generation hold more songs, maybe to have a better screen, additional capabilities like Bluetooth. They became lighter. The battery life was longer. So the point is just to say that we don't want to think about competition between firms just in terms of price, but we want to think about all of the characteristics of the product. If this sort of competition goes on over a long period of time, you can have quite a significant change in the nature of the product. Looking at one iPod Nano to another, they look a little bit different, but they don't look like very radically different devices. But you get a rather different picture if you look at the life story of the Sony Walkman. Over this period of 35 years, the Sony Walkman has changed very considerably from a rather simple looking but innovative, very innovative device back in 1979 that held a cassette cartridge all the way up to the model that's shown in 2015, a very different device indeed. Well, as the Sony Walkman evolved and became ever more sophisticated and had higher quality, the same thing happened with its competition. So I guess the point I might just make here is to say that this kind of dynamic competition between firms has actually been of tremendous importance. If you think about the last 100 years or so, and you think about how the standard of living of everyone in the industrialized countries has changed over that period of time, there's been simply an enormous increase in the standard of living, and it's come about as a result of this kind of competition to develop new products, new processes, and as a result, it's greatly changed the nature of things available to people. Just think, for example, how automobiles have changed over the last 100 years, or how airplanes have evolved. Well, what I've been just sketching out here is this kind of dynamic product differentiation that involves changing the characteristics of the products over time. There's another kind of product differentiation that doesn't do that. I would call it static, as opposed to being dynamic. So once the product has been differentiated or sort of separated from the competition in some way, then it doesn't really get changed very much. So an example that came to mind, and images that were easy to find, were these images of chocolate bars. So these are kind of classic chocolate bars that really haven't changed in decades. Well, let's think of some other way in which the threat of substitutes could be dealt with. We've mentioned the idea of switching costs before, so I can be relatively brief here. The idea of switching costs is just to say that it costs customers something to switch between suppliers or to switch brands. So, as I mentioned before, this could be the result of just the sellers being far apart, and it could take some time and effort to locate one and to contact them and find out what they have for sale. You might also have to negotiate prices, which could be a time-consuming process as well. And you might have to determine the qualities of the goods that were being sold by other sellers. So I could just introduce a couple of terms which are not in your readings actually, but are worth keeping in mind. We could divide goods into two different categories, roughly. We could talk about what are called experience goods. So to know the qualities or the characteristics of those goods, you really need to experience them. You need to have some time to experience them, sample them, in order to judge their quality. The opposite of an experience good is called an inspection good. So that means you can just inspect it, or you can look at it, and you know all that there really is to know about that good. One rather obvious example of an experience good is something like a restaurant meal. In order to judge the quality of the food in a restaurant, you really have to experience it yourself, or perhaps you have to talk to enough people who've experienced it, people whose taste that you trust. So those goods are definitely non-inspection goods. However, if you think about fast food restaurants, it seems to me that what they're doing is making what they offer in different places essentially the same. So that if you've been to, say, one Tim Hortons, you know exactly what the coffee tastes like and what the donuts are like and so on. And so if you go to another one, their product effectively becomes an inspection good. You know exactly what the quality is going to be. It's not going to be an experience good. That could be useful for the fast food restaurant because it means that there's going to be a greater switching cost for somebody to, for example, go and look for a local restaurant. You may have a choice between, say, having a mediocre meal at McDonald's, and you know what you're going to get, or you might go to a local restaurant and really have very little idea of what you're going to get. So the uniformity of foods that are offered by fast food restaurants might be a way of increasing switching costs for customers. And as I mentioned before, there can also be costs of learning how to use a product. So you can kind of lock yourself into using a particular kind of machine or a particular kind of software just because the costs of switching to using something else could be rather high. So one strategy that firms could undertake is to see if you can make it relatively easy for customers to switch to your product and away from some other one. One software program that I used to use a lot is called WordPerfect. It essentially does the same sort of thing as Word, but it's produced by a small Canadian corporation. WordPerfect will read and save files in Word format, so it makes it easy for you to switch away from Word to use WordPerfect because, of course, you can read your old Word files. And if somebody else wants a Word file from you, you can send it to them in that format. Although Word will also read WordPerfect files. You could also do the opposite. You could raise the cost of switching away from your product. Well, an example that occurred to me is you could imagine a situation in which when a customer buys the product, there may be a coupon inside it or attached to it that offers them a discount on their next purchase, some certain amount of money off or a percentage reduction in the price. So by offering a small discount to buy the product again, that's going to make it more difficult or less attractive for that customer to buy some substitute instead. You might be able to kind of get them to buy the product over and over by offering a small discount. So what you might be doing is developing a kind of brand loyalty, making demand more price inelastic. Now, one thing that's worth remembering is that customers aren't stupid. So they're going to be aware of switching costs in general. I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. But you have to realize that there are limits in exploiting switching costs. So if customers realize that they're going to get locked into a product, they're going to be careful before they choose that product. So that means that most competition really exists at the stage where the buyers are thinking, what product are they going to get into that has high switching costs? So they'll compare those very carefully and then commit themselves. Well, I'm going to continue this in another file because this one is probably going to get too big.